Economics is not quite as complicated as people think. Economics, quite simply, is the science of managing supply and demand. The higher the demand, the higher the price, and so is the opposite. Economics is actually not complicated at all. When we talk about Zimbabwean economics, we immediately think about hyperinflation and the struggling Zim dollar. The Zimbabwean dollar is rapidly losing value against the US dollar, and the rates of inflation in Zimbabwe are through the roof. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe is, however, not limited to the Zim dollar. The cost of goods in US dollars has also risen sharply in recent months. There's two questions to be answered. What's the cause and how do we fix it? Let's start with the basics. The Zimbabwean dollar has lost up to 70% of its value against the US dollar since the beginning of the year, and that trend is set to continue. Part of the problem is that Zimbabwe is operating a multi-currency system, and 80% of all transactions in Zimbabwe are completed in US dollars. Judging by current trends, if nothing is done to intervene, Zimbabwe could see close to 100% of all transactions being completed in US dollars by year-end 2023. Now, a lot of Zimbabweans might be thinking, well, that's a good thing. Let's ditch the ailing Zim currency and fully adopt the US dollar. Maybe this might ease the inflation. Well, the answer is no, quite the opposite actually. By fully dollarizing, inflation will further increase to levels previously unseen or heard of in Zimbabwe. This will be caused by the increased demand for US dollars in Zimbabwe, yet Zimbabwe doesn't have the ability nor the means to increase the circulation of US dollars in Zimbabwe. I'll give an example. In a fully dollarized Zimbabwe, civil servants employed in education, law enforcement, city council, and many other government functions will need to be paid in US dollars. The cost of paying those civil servants in US dollars will be passed on to the Zimbabwean people through increased rates, increased utilities, and increased tax rates. Businesses alike will start paying their staff in US dollars, and they will also pass on these increased costs to consumers. The net outcome is that the cost of goods will simply go up. That's inflation. Like I mentioned earlier, it's all about supply and demand. Simply put, the Zimbabwean government cannot meet the demand for US dollars in Zimbabwe, and that is the reason why inflation continues to rise in Zimbabwe. The only way to increase the circulation of US dollars in Zimbabwe is to print US dollars in Zimbabwe. And you guessed it, that will never happen. Quite simply, this is the reason why the government insists on maintaining the ailing Zim dollar, so that they can print it and increase currency circulation in Zimbabwe. Another factor to consider is the impact dollarization has on local businesses. Dollarization increases the cost of doing business in Zimbabwe, which in turn makes locally manufactured products more expensive than imports from places such as South Africa, Zambia, China, and the list is endless. In essence, the demand for locally produced products will be significantly reduced, which will subsequently lead to the closure of many local businesses, causing thousands upon thousands of job losses in Zimbabwe. In other words, complete disaster. There's a reason why Zimbabweans don't import basic goods manufactured in the US or the UK. The reason being the cost of manufacturing in those countries is simply too high, with the cost of labor being the main contributing factor. So by default, if we apply the same logic, purchasing products manufactured in Zimbabwe is now equally as expensive as importing products directly from the US. What this means is that locally manufactured goods cannot compete with foreign imports. This is why Malaysians are flooding Zimbabwe with basic goods from South Africa, simply because Zimbabwean products are too expensive. Zimbabweans need to realize that fully adopting the US dollar is not a solution. As attractive as it seems, not everything that glitters is gold. Complete dollarization will be the final stroke that obliterates any semblance of Zimbabwean industry as we know it today. And if you are still in any doubt, do some research and take a look at what happened to Venezuela when they fully dollarized their economy. Just take a look. I know there's a lot of economic commentators out there who will argue that Zimbabwe is dollarizing because the Zimbabwean dollar itself has got no international value. This is true. A big part of this is the fact that Zimbabwe has been operating under extreme international sanctions for the last 20 years. So let me be frank, there's quite simply no international demand for Zimbabwean dollars. This makes it virtually impossible for Zimbabwean businesses and entities to transact outside of Zimbabwe. As a result of this, the Zimbabwean government introduced a multi-currency system to enable businesses to collect forex directly from consumers, which in turn enables those businesses to complete international payments and restock their shelves. Remember, it's all about supply and demand. Yes, Zimbabwe is under severe sanctions, however, it's not the end of the world. The solution is actually quite simple. Increase the demand for Zimbabwean dollars locally and internationally. It's that simple. The problem is that some of the policies introduced over the last few years have decreased the demand for Zimbabwean dollars both locally and internationally. For example, policies such as the one which requires customs duty to be paid in US dollars instead of local currency have further reduced the demand for Zim dollars. This has in turn weakened the value of the Zim dollar against the US dollar and has ultimately led to increased rates of inflation in Zimbabwe. Therefore, by implementing policies which increase the demand of the Zim dollar, inflation can be significantly reduced. Let's go through some of those ideas. In 2022, the Zimbabwean government introduced minted gold coins which were offered to citizens as a hedge against inflation. On the surface, it's a great idea. However, the reality is that regular Zimbabweans cannot afford to buy 1-ounce gold coins, and it was destined to fail. Introducing gold coins to the Zimbabwean economy itself is a great idea. The problem is the execution. What should have been done is the introduction of smaller sized gold coins from 1 to 10 grams at the most. By doing that, it makes gold coins more accessible to regular Zimbabweans, henceforth increasing the demand for gold coins in Zimbabwe as a store of value. By default, the demand for Zimbabwean dollars would have increased significantly because these gold coins can only be purchased using local currency. In actual fact, I believe the government must go even further. I put forward that the government should pay civil servants year-end bonuses in gold coins. Specialist bank accounts should be created specifically for civil servants. These accounts will allow them to vault the gold coins paid by the government and redeem them. These vaulted gold coins would only be redeemable a year from receipt. However, these vaulted coins can be traded as digital tokens in exchange for cash in Zimbabwean dollars, or the tokens can be used for day-to-day electronic transactions. In May 2023, the government introduced gold-backed digital tokens which can be bought by the Zimbabwean public for between 10 to 5,000 US dollars. The idea behind this is to expand value-preserving instruments available to the Zimbabwean public. Good idea on paper, however, the problem again lies in the execution. Rather than inviting hard-stricken Zimbabweans to buy these gold-backed digital tokens, the Zimbabwean government should issue them out as bonuses to civil servants to stimulate the economy and further strengthen the Zimbabwean dollar. Zimbabwe needs to implement a raft of urgent policy changes. The time for temporary stopgap measures has to come to an end. It's time for serious change. In actual fact, one will realize that Zimbabwe has a lot of leverage. Zimbabwe has some of the world's largest platinum, chrome, and lithium reserves. It's time for Zimbabwe to leverage the insatiable global demand for these metals by insisting that Zimbabwean minerals, including platinum, chrome, lithium, and crops like tobacco, are paid for in Zimbabwean dollars. By doing so, Zimbabwe will increase international demand for Zimbabwean dollars, strengthen the Zimbabwean dollar, and ultimately end hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. Countries like Russia have used this tactic in recent times to bolster the fast-tumbling ruble in 2022 when they were placed under international sanctions similar to the one Zimbabwe is under because of the invasion in Ukraine. And guess what? It worked. The same way Russia leveraged their oil and gas, Zimbabwe must do the same. We must leverage our mineral resources immediately. Zimbabwe is operating under extreme conditions and we need radical policy change. Another big challenge that Zimbabwe is facing is the influx of basic goods from South Africa, Zambia, and China. Zimbabwe has the capacity and expertise to manufacture many of the basic goods consumed in Zimbabwe. However, Zimbabweans have allowed imports to oust locally produced goods. In May 2023, the Zimbabwean government suspended import duty on basic commodities. This is a short-sighted solution for a much bigger problem. By suspending import duty on basic goods, you essentially remove local products from shelves because they cannot compete with the price of duty-free imports. This will result in Zimbabwean manufacturers shutting down and thousands of job losses, further lamenting Zimbabwe's problems. Zimbabwe needs to strengthen its border with South Africa and implement a complete ban on the import of basic goods in Zimbabwe. We simply need to eat what we kill and learn to live within our means. By doing so, Zimbabwe will revive its industries, reduce unemployment, and begin to attract foreign direct investments. Internally, there's a lot of policy change which needs to be implemented within Zimbabwe. It doesn't make sense to me why local city councils around the country are demanding parking fees and other fines in US dollars. A lot of city councils are pressuring Zimbabwean citizens into paying rates in US dollars. This is totally unacceptable. In doing so, landlords are now pressured into charging rentals for both domestic and commercial use in US dollars. This has resulted in increased rental prices and the general increase in the cost of living in Zimbabwe to unsustainable levels. This is part of the reason why locally produced goods in Zimbabwe are so expensive. The policymakers in Zimbabwe need to act swiftly and ban city councils and other government authorities from charging fees or rates in US dollars. Demanding US dollar payments simply increases the demand for US dollars in Zimbabwe, hence inflation is continually on the rise. Banning US dollar payments to government authorities will significantly increase the demand for Zim dollars and ease inflation. I would urge policymakers to go even further and completely ban the use of US dollars countrywide. US dollar transactions should be limited to the energy sector, fuel, gas, and electricity. All other transactions must be completed in Zimbabwean dollars. It's time for the government to do their role and make the difficult decisions for the betterment of the country. I think most Zimbabweans are now tired of the stopgap measures which never hit the spot. If we want radical change, we need radical solutions. We as Zimbabweans also have an important role to play in the restoration of Zimbabwe. We need to take time to understand the difficult decisions that need to be made, and we need to prepare ourselves for the difficult times ahead.